Well folks, not a day goes by where I'm not asked this question: Hell Let Loose or Post Scriptum? Every time I stream one of these games or make a video about either game, it's a question I'm asked so incredibly frequently that I wanted to bring you guys an updated video on this topic, because a lot has changed since the last time I spoke on this matter. Now before I start this video, I think it's worth saying that if you own one of these games, it's definitely worth buying the other one. Or if you're looking to buy one or the other, it's worth investing in both over time, or if it's something that's actively available to you financially. They're both great projects with a great set of developers, and they're doing wonderful things, and they deserve as much support from the widest audience as humanly possible. Honestly, I wouldn't even consider this versus video much of a versus video anymore. They're both two fantastic games, fully feature-fled and just have wonderful things about them, and to that extent I feel as though whatever you buy, you will certainly be happy with. So definitely don't worry about that. You're not going to feel cheated by either of these two titles. They certainly offer a whole host of gameplay that's worthwhile, enjoyable, and something that I've enjoyed every single minute of. So with all of that said, I actually figured it would probably make more sense for me in this video to actually talk about the differences between these two games. Why would you get one of them instead of the other, and why do they play and function differently? And with that, you guys can probably make a much more informed decision as to which game suits you much more. I will also talk about whether or not one game has superior features, but for the most part I do want to focus on the differences, because I feel as though it's the glove that fits best that is most likely what people want to get. So let's start. And what I would say primarily differentiates these two games is the hardcore nature of them, or the hardcore-ness as some of you would probably say. And that's because they rest on slightly two different scales, or ends of a spectrum. Now whilst they're both hardcore and tactical shooters in the sense that they possess very lethal time to kills and rely mostly on team play, it's safe to say that there is a disparity between the two. Hell Let Loose is certainly something I would consider to be more accessible and slightly on the more casual end of things, whereas Post Scriptum is on the more hardcore end and the niche end of things, closer to something like Squad and Arma 3. But I don't say casual in necessarily a negative way. There are some things about Hell Let Loose and the nature of its gameplay that I feel make it much more a pick up and play experience, something you can sit down of an evening, whip out your keyboard and mouse and have a great time with. In contrast, Post Scriptum is certainly much more team play orientated at a much more hardcore level. You know, if you don't have a well organized team in Post Scriptum, you will fall apart. Now that's not to say that team play doesn't play a role in Hell Let Loose, and certainly a well-organized squad or a community server has fantastic gameplay dynamics on Hell Let Loose. But in Post Scriptum, simply team play is your bread and butter, and without it you will absolutely fall flat on your face. And this is what is the major difference for me here. Some of the mechanics on Post Scriptum are certainly much more difficult to master as well. They both possess things like bullet ballistic systems, but I find shooting at range is much more challenging on Post Scriptum. Disabling and destroying vehicles is much more challenging on Post Scriptum, and in my humble opinion, capturing or defending objectives is a much more challenging and more skillful affair on Post Scriptum due to how positioning works, and I'll get into these nuances and differences later on. But if you think of Arma 3 as the most hardcore game imaginable, and something like Call of Duty as the most casual game imaginable, with Battlefield being closer to Call of Duty and Hell Let Loose being sort of in the middle, then Post Scriptum and Squad would be closer to Arma. There's a sort of visualization for this, but you get the gist. People who are accustomed to Battlefield-style gameplay will certainly feel at home in both games, but more so in Hell Let Loose, and people who are more accustomed to things like Squad and Arma 3 will certainly feel more at home in a game like Post Scriptum. So let's start with team play, and team play in both of these games is relatively important. I would say though that in Post Scriptum, it takes more of a forefront. In Post Scriptum, if your team doesn't work together like I find often in Hell Let Loose, they will completely fall apart. You will lose every game, and you will get absolutely steamrolled. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, you can sometimes have even entire squads that aren't really communicating with each other or communicating within themselves, and the gameplay doesn't really get affected too much, because at the end of the day, the game focuses on critical capture points, whereas in Post Scriptum, whilst capture points are important, it's getting into those positions and getting into positions to take out those points that is much more the challenging task. So in my opinion, team play certainly holds up much more strongly in Post Scriptum. There is an element of team play in Hell Let Loose, and it certainly does help to have an organised squad, or an organised community server, or an organised team in general, but the gameplay stays roughly the same. Now of course, you know, an organised team will always stomp an unorganised team in Hell Let Loose, but most of the time it can sometimes stay the same. You know, you don't notice too much of a difference in gameplay dynamics, except for just how poorly the other team might react to certain situations. And for me, I think that's a big difference in the game. You know, you'll rarely find somebody in Post Scriptum who won't talk on their microphone. It's just something that is almost a cultural thing and necessitated by the game. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, you will encounter the odd person who isn't really willing to talk, or just kind of wants to sit there and play the game of an evening. And I'm not saying that one thing is necessarily worse than the other. In my opinion, you know, sometimes I do just like to pick up Hell Let Loose and not talk and just mow down some Germans, alright? And on the same token, sometimes I like having a bit more of an interactive team play experience, and for that I have Post Scriptum as well. You'll certainly find a lot of crossover in this department, and I don't think you'll necessarily be disappointed by team play on either side of the spectrum, but I do find that in general Post Scriptum has a little bit more of it. But what makes these two games radically different in terms of gameplay? Because on the surface you're looking at two hardcore and tactical shooters that are doing relatively similar things, so what makes these nuances and specific details different? Well, the major difference between the two games is how their objective modes function. And in both of these game modes you'll find a sort of conquest style mode like in Battlefield, but also an offensive / invasion mode akin to front lines in Battlefield. So one mode where you can capture all the objectives provided you've captured the one before that, and another mode where the enemy team has all the objectives and you have to steadily, phase by phase, roll through the map. I think the major difference to me here is the emphasis on objectives and how you get there. So in Post Scriptum, you can spawn anywhere on the map, provided that a spawn point has been placed down by a squad leader, or an FOB/logistics truck has been moved into place. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, you can only spawn in your own zone. There is a friendly captured zone and an enemy zone which is determined by the front line of the battlefield. For whatever objective you happen to be attacking or defending, the front line shifts based on that. So if I capture an objective right up close to the enemy's main base, my front line is outside the enemy base, and that determines where you can place things. You can only place the actual hard spawn points for your entire team, which is known as a garrison, within this zone, and you can place outposts, which are like rally points in Post Scriptum, anywhere roughly behind that zone, but not too far behind enemy lines. I think it's like 1 or 2 grid squares you're allowed to move behind. And because of that, you have two very different experiences. In Post Scriptum, gameplay and engagements tends to be a loose experience, where like engagements sort of happen here and there, and the victors of those engagements advance steadily closer towards the objective. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, I find a lot of the gameplay is fixated around one objective a lot of the time, and is focused around the front line of battle. And that's the very big difference for me. You know, Hell Let Loose is a very intense frontline battle orientated game, and Post Scriptum has sort of breaks between gameplay that aren't necessarily bad things, but it's like maneuvering and flanking into position. Of course you can do those things in Hell Let Loose, but the emphasis is much more harder here on Post Scriptum. You need to move into positions, you have to win your engagements bit by bit, and steadily advance with your team. You will have some moments of pure intensity and action in Post Scriptum where you're fighting over one objective fiercely for an extended period of time, but all in all I find there's more breaks in gameplay in Post Scriptum than there is in Hell Let Loose, and there's a larger emphasis in Post Scriptum on outmaneuvering your opponent rather than just out-shooting them. You'll have instances of gameplay in Hell Let Loose where it's literally just one wall of guns and explosions versus another wall of guns and explosions, and you will have those moments in Post Scriptum, but a lot of it's more about winning specific engagements, squad v squad battles, or just flanking into the right location and doing some serious damage in a short space of time. And with that kind of places the game in two separate points. The meaningfulness of engagements and defending your spawn points is very, very hardcore in Post Scriptum. You have to look after your rally points and FOBs and logistics trucks, whereas in Hell Let Loose, you know, garrisons and outposts can be put up more or less by anyone at any given point, and it doesn't make them that much important. Of course, they are still quite important in the game, and you will have to rely on these things heavily in the entire match. but it is much easier to get them out on the field. Whereas if you lose a logistics truck or a spawn point in Post Scriptum, it can have devastating consequences for the attack of an objective or the defense of an objective. So overall, I'd say you find a little bit more intensity in Hell Let Loose's gameplay, and a little bit more on the scale of tactics in Post Scriptum's gameplay. Again, there is a lot of overlap here, but I find Hell Let Loose to be much more of a pick up and play experience, where if things aren't quite going right around you, you'll still have a relatively decent time. Whereas if you're losing spawn points left, right and center in Post Scriptum, you will get landslid quite easily, and you probably will have a pretty miserable experience. Overall, I'd say the intense gameplay of Hell Let Loose often creates more fun more consistently, but there is something really engaging about the core of battle in Post Scriptum. You know, when you finally oust that squad or nail that headshot, or take out that one MG42, there's a real sense of victory in that I don't think is replicated much in Hell Let Loose, because you know they'll spawn back in relatively quickly. It also makes roles much more critical as well in Post Scriptum. You know, if you lose a medic in Post Scriptum, it's this devastating thing that you need to get your medics back alive, or if they've been shot in the head, they're gone. You know, if somebody gets blown up or is shot in the head, you can't revive them. Now in Hell Let Loose, if somebody gets blown up, you can't revive them, but if they get shot in the head, sometimes you can. But because redeployments in general are much more lucid and easy in Hell Let Loose, medics and other roles like RPGs and machine gunners aren't all that important, because they will just get back into the action relatively quickly, whereas losing an asset like that in the field in Post Scriptum has relatively harsh consequences on your squad. Next up is communities. Now both of these games boast fantastic communities, and whilst I will say Hell Let Loose certainly has a larger or more active player base, you will find dedicated community servers on both of these games, and really this is a huge bonus of these games, and there actually is a lot of overlap between the clans and groups of people who play on both of these titles. The best experiences you will have in Post Scriptum and Hell Let Loose are on the community servers you join, and their discords that you decide to take part in, and just interacting with people. You know, it's really a wonderful experience, and I can think of a handful of servers off the top of my head, like TLR, Team Dix, 2FJG, Bloodbound, you know, Raw Battalion, and these are mostly UK servers, but you get the gist. You know, both of these servers and both of these communities will transition across both games most likely, and you'll get a really great sense of community and a really great sense of team play on both of these games, which is a good experience and a definite pro in terms of both of these titles, so no huge disparities there at all. So let's talk animations, audio, and gunplay. These are three sort of key markers, I'd say, of the game. Now, animations in both games are actually pretty good. I find they're sometimes a little bit more fluid in Post Scriptum, in the sense that the animations just seem to fit the game really well. That being said, Hell Let Loose has had an animation update that's made it much more fluid, and I'll be honest with you, both of the animations of both of these titles are in a fantastic place. Character models look great, reloads look great, everything works as intended. Neither of these games will feel particularly janky due to the animation system that they have, and whilst this was a problem in the past for Hell Let Loose, it's no longer a problem anymore. One thing I would note though is that Post Scriptum certainly has some superior effects, both in terms of like artillery and tank explosions and grenade explosions. There's a real oomph to those in Post Scriptum, and they sometimes outshine Hell Let Loose in a certain way. That's not to say that the effects are lacking in Hell Let Loose, you know, you will certainly still enjoy them, but the immersiveness of effects in Post Scriptum I find regularly simply can't be beaten. So what about sound/audio? Well, I think it's safe to say that there is a superior hierarchy here. Now, whilst Hell Let Loose did have an overhaul recently which drastically improved the soundscaping of the weapons, how they sound, and actually how the sound adjusts, so if you're in a woodland area, or if you're in a snowy area, or if you're in an urban environment, sounds will actually adjust based on them. It still isn't as good as Post Scriptum. Post Scriptum in every sense of the word has superior audio, it sounds much better, and in my opinion Post Scriptum and Squad are actually the gold standard of audio. I actually think in some cases it's better than AAA titles like Battlefield. You simply can't get better than these games, and positional audio especially is much more superior in Post Scriptum. The audio to Hell Let Loose is progressively getting better, and it's likely something that will continue to get better. It's not necessarily bad, I don't think any of the audio in Hell Let Loose is necessarily off-putting, but you do notice the difference in quality between the two games. As for gunplay, both of these games boast very similar ballistic systems, and neither of them have any drawbacks, so to speak. You know, these are both two lethal games. You know, a standard issue rifle will always kill in one shot, maybe two shots over distance. You will have to bandage your wounds, and you will have to be revived by enemy players or hit respawn, and lose out on either the action or actually lose out on physical tickets in-game. But gunplay in general is fairly solid across both titles. I'd actually say both of them boast relatively good gunplay systems with good animations for recoil, good reload animations, good lethality, a good feeling to them. In neither of the games you will get confirmation of a kill. In Post Scriptum you get like a thud if you hit somebody in the body and a ping if you hit someone in the head, and in Hell Let Loose you get the ping if you hit someone in the head, but other than that you will have to visually confirm your kills, and really I'd say gunplay is about the same here. The only thing I would say is that the gunplay to Post Scriptum is in some ways a little bit more challenging and is a little bit more advanced. And the reason I say this is because the ballistic system in Hell Let Loose has very fast bullet velocities over range. So if somebody's 200-300 meters away, you only need to aim like the tiniest bit in front of them to hit that target, whereas in Post Scriptum you really need to think about it. You need to aim your sniper or zero your sniper an extra couple hundred meters, or aim up, or aim like a meter in front of them to hit that target over range, and there certainly is a skill gap in that sense in Post Scriptum. So in some ways I'd say Post Scriptum has advanced gunplay, but in neither of these games will you be like, oh, the gunplay in this sucks. They're both very satisfying experiences and something that you will enjoy. However, I will note that Post Scriptum certainly has a much better skill curve in terms of gunplay, and hitting characters over range is much more challenging in that game than it is in Hell Let Loose. But overall, two great sets of gunplay. I think Post Scriptum slightly edges out Hell Let Loose here, but to be honest with you, I've never really played either game and gone, man, this gunplay isn't that great. They both offer really satisfying experiences that I think both people, or anybody really, would enjoy. Finally, let's talk about graphics, servers, and performance. These are key things that lots of people ask me about, so why not? Let's talk about them. Graphically, Hell Let Loose is a prettier game than Post Scriptum. You know, it's no surprise really. It looks great. The interiors of buildings are certainly much more detailed. The graphics of your surroundings is much more advanced, and it looks like a near AAA game in terms of graphical standards. But often when people make this comparison, I don't think they're giving you guys the full picture. Because although Hell Let Loose is certainly a prettier game, that doesn't necessarily make it superior. I find in Hell Let Loose, the graphics, I would call them almost muddy or foggy in some kind of way. Like, it isn't inherently clear over range where enemies are, whereas in Post Scriptum it's very easy to identify targets over range, provided they're not in any kind of concealment. I think the best way to sort of frame this is that when objects over distance appear in Hell Let Loose, there's so much detail in your surroundings that you very rarely see those objects move, and it's difficult to pinpoint or identify targets. Whereas in Post Scriptum, pinpointing and identifying movement is much easier, and there is a clarity to the game, much like in Squad, where you can see things hundreds of meters away if something moves that you catch in your sightline. The same applies here. And I think that's kind of a trade-off, you know. The graphics in Hell Let Loose look nicer, but you'll definitely have a much harder time seeing things, and I actually end up playing the game on lower graphical presets just because the detail of the game makes it nearly impossible to see some targets over range. You know, I have an i9-9900K and a 2080 Ti, but most of my settings in Hell Let Loose are set to medium just because it's so difficult to see everything with graphical fidelity. The same applies to something like Battlefield 5. Battlefield 5 is a pretty game, but for the most part of the early life cycle of that game, it was a pain in the ass to see your opponents. So overall, I'd say definitely Hell Let Loose is a much more better looking game. You know, you will get that visual appeal to the game, and it's something that I think fans definitely want, you know, that kind of immersiveness from really impressive graphics. And I would say that Post Scriptum works better functionally speaking as a first-person shooter because of the clarity of the graphics and the clarity of seeing things over ranges. That being said, you won't be disappointed with either of them. I think YouTube compression never really does either of them any favors, and they both actually look pretty decent. You won't look at Post Scriptum or Hell Let Loose and go, wow, this is crappy. You'll be relatively impressed. But I will say that Hell Let Loose I find is much more visually appealing and really does a better job of immersing you in the environment around you. Server-wise, both of these games boast higher player counts. Post Scriptum tends to sit around 40v40, with Hell Let Loose around 50v50, and you'll never really have any server issues, and there will be lots of community servers. The slight bump in player count on Hell Let Loose, I find, makes the game much more interesting in terms of infantry gameplay, because there's lots of infantry squads, but you won't notice a huge difference, so don't worry about servers at all, in my opinion. Finally, we have performance. Now, again, I have a pretty powerful PC, and I play these games at 1440p with the goal of getting higher frame rates if possible. And I will say that they perform about the same. You know, I get roughly 80 FPS in Hell Let Loose and roughly 80 FPS in Post Scriptum, and I'll be honest with you, you don't really notice a lot of changes in terms of performance when you change your graphical settings, and the reason for that is a lot of the performance of the game is tied to what's happening server side and the actual optimization of in-game assets that aren't necessarily client-based. And the reason for that is just because of how these games work in terms of ballistics, explosions, and how they simulate everything that's happening on screen. And because they're both Unreal Engine 4 games, it does mean that they will get better over time. I think at the moment they're around about the same, and you won't notice a huge difference between performance in both of these titles, but they will definitely improve. For example, Squad is an Unreal Engine 4 game that currently gives me around 130 FPS at some of the highest graphical settings. So optimization is certainly something that can be massively achieved here for both games, but it's really down to whether or not the developers prioritize it at any given point during development life cycles. We know Hell Let Loose is certainly prioritizing it, and we know that Post Scriptum is running off of the Squad codebase, meaning that it's definitely possible we'll see similar frame rates of Squad, so it's really difficult to say whether or not they will instantly get better or get better in a couple of months, but ultimately they will be optimized over time. At the moment, I'd say you need a relatively medium to beefy rig to get the best out of these games, but that's something that could very well change soon. So finally, what is my verdict on these two games? Well, there's a couple of other things here that I want to talk about. I ultimately believe that both of these games are a great investment, and I feel as though you will really enjoy either of these titles, and in fact, if you can afford to do so, I recommend you support both of them, because they're two sets of developers that have been doing wonderful things, and have been improving their games and offering really unique and fun experiences. But in terms of which one I would currently recommend, and again, I do want to underpin all of this, you know, there is a real importance here that when you do this video, and when I, finally finish this video, you guys take the time to go and look at the web pages for either website and the Steam store, and see how the updates are coming along. These are two early access games, they both will be launched over time, I don't have any doubts about that, but they will launch in very different ways with various different levels of content. Post Scriptum at the moment has a much more extensive content library with British faction, US faction, the French faction, the German faction, and the parachute regiments for the German faction as well, whereas Hell Let Loose only has the Americans and the Germans, and that will change soon. They do have some content planned out, but at the moment they will launch in very different states. Hell Let Loose is planning on releasing the Eastern Front and has a full roadmap for the game of upcoming releases that will be coming after the most recent update, Update 7. Post Scriptum has a Trello board that kind of indicates what will be coming next, but there doesn't seem to be any huge big content updates on the way. So with that all in mind, it's worth looking into that and where these games are at retrospectively after you watch this video. But I will say this, at the moment, and this is just at the moment, Hell Let Loose has a much more consistent and planned out roadmap for what's coming next for the game, including the introduction of the Eastern Front, including the introduction of more improvements to the game. And whilst Post Scriptum does have that to some degree, we haven't heard any announcements about the next chapter of the game and what other factions and what other maps we might see, whereas the Squad game, which is from the same publisher, has had multiple factions and multiple maps announced. So it's something to bear in mind, that lack of announcement I feel is something worth thinking about, and if you're watching this video, definitely go and check out to see if there has been one. But at the moment, I would say Team 17 are more committed to bringing content to Hell Let Loose than Periscope Games are to bringing games and content to Post Scriptum. That could of course change massively, but it's why I've reached this verdict. At the moment, I would definitely advocate you buy both games, but if you had to choose between one or the other, I would currently go for Hell Let Loose, just because of that commitment of content, and just because there is this overarching roadmap to the game that it will drastically improve, and that's kind of there, but not quite there for Post Scriptum. Either way, I think you'll enjoy both games. Either way, I think it's more about whether or not you are a more hardcore player or a slightly more casual player, and those things that I mentioned earlier on will suit some people more than others. You know, some of you will want that more team play orientated experience that's a bit more hardcore, a bit more lethal. Some of you will want something that you can more easily just pick up and play of an evening, and that's perfectly fine. I don't think either of the other games, you know, be it Post Scriptum or Hell Let Loose, have necessarily superior qualities over one another, but they just have things that make them different titles. Overall though, at the moment, I'm more inclined to recommend Hell Let Loose because it is a game with a more consistent roadmap, and as a content creator, you know, I do have a responsibility to tell you people that because, you know, you are investing in this title after all. That being said, I know that there will be stuff coming for Post Scriptum in the future, so in this sense, I think it's worth just saying which game suits you more and why. If there is a reason one game suits you more than the other, then that is your answer, and that's what you should go for. At the moment, for me, I think Hell Let Loose is a slightly better fit due to that content dedication, but for you guys, it might vary a little bit. Thank you guys all for watching this video. If you're interested in games like Post Scriptum, Hell Let Loose, Squad, Insurgency Sandstorm, or any kind of tactical shooter, make sure to hit that sub and like button. And feel free to check out my live streams, which stream at 6:30 PM UK time, Monday to Saturday, with the exception of Tuesdays. As always folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.